everybody, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton. And on today's episode, it's kind of like a part 2-3 sort of a thing. We've had a relational guest that has joined us and given us stories and all of that sort of stuff. And now we get to talk to the boots on the ground a bit about what's going on. And so we're here today. Ken and I are here with John and Tanya Lynch. And we're excited to talk to him. Ken, you want to give us a little bit more of a background?
Yeah, well, I've known John. I met Tanya later, but I've known John since he was a boy. And on our previous podcasts, we have twice had Joan Lynch, now Runblad, who is John's mother. And back in the day, as they say, I was good friends with both Joan, or Joni as we called her, and her husband, Bill. And I've often told stories when I've been preaching about this couple that I knew who had left the Vineyard Anaheim and gone to Russia and then onward to Ukraine. And they'd seen a great revival in Ukraine. So Joni is the wife of that couple, and Bill went home to the Lord kind of at the front end of the COVID crisis. And, he had run his race, he'd run well, but anyway, so Bill's no longer with us, and John is their son. And essentially, I don't think this is an overstatement. He's carrying on the work that his mother and father began in Ukraine. And I wanted to talk a little more about what's it like to be there today, in the years now with mom and dad gone. Dad's in heaven and mom's back in the U.S. But I wanted to start out just by talking a bit also about their background, so that everybody has a little bit of understanding of who are these guys, John and Tanya Lynch, anyway. So with that, welcome to the show, guys.
Yeah,
it's great to be here, Ken. I'm a big fan of the show.
That's true.
You probably listened to most of the episodes, probably 90% at least. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, you can go fanboy now because you're on the show that you like to listen to, I guess. So let's start out with basics. Sometimes it's tough being a missionary kid, or an MK as they're called. Tell us a little bit about how you came to faith, each of you actually, and for you, John, in particular, what was it like to be an MK growing up in Ukraine with all of the hardships in the years after the Iron Curtain came down? Ukraine's a much more developed and modern country now than it was when your parents, shall I say, took you or drug you there as a boy. To be with them while they were serving on the mission field. Let's start out with that story.
Yeah, I guess it's the kind of thing when I found out about it, it was a shock because, I was 11 years old at the time. My parents, you probably know the long story of how God called them. So, they had a lot of context and a lot of words from the Lord about it and stuff. Unfortunately, at 11 years old, I wasn't that aware of a lot of these things that God had been speaking to them about. So to me, it was just out of the blue, like, we're going to Russia. My first reaction was pretty negative. I was like, Russia? Like, why in the world are we going to Russia? Why would we ever want to go there? Like, I didn't even know much about Russia. All I knew is that at least it seemed to me like it was just this sort of gray place where the sun never comes out and it's just real whatever. I don't know. I didn't really know what to think of it, but we were living in Park City, Utah at the time. So I was kind of, I grew up in the Christian home. My dad was a pastor. So, I can't say I was in a very good place spiritually at the time. It was just kind of the normal kind of like you're beginning your teenage years, kind of just kind of trying to enjoy life, going skiing, had some friends and, it was just a big shock though. I literally thought it was just like a short-term missions trip when she told me. I was like, oh, okay. I thought, well, it can't be that bad. Like, what is it, like for a week? And she's like, no, we're going longer than that. And I was like, well, what is it, a month? And she's like, no, we're going for at least a year. And I was like, oh man. So I was pretty upset at first. But I'm a pretty kind of kind of guy. I like to settle down. I don't really like to move around that much, actually. So it was a big shock, but it took some time to get used to it. But I mean, I don't regret it, at all. One bit. It was great to be in the middle of what happened and just experience that. And even though it wasn't always easy, but there's just a lot of different cultural shocks and different things. I remember being in when we first came to Moscow, we were staying in some hotel in Moscow, and we went to have like dinner and lunch. I think it was dinner in this like hotel cafe something. And back then everything was just so different. It was just really funky. Everything was kind of weird. And they started asking me about what I want on the menu. And being 11 years old, I was just 100% sure that they, like, everything else sounded totally bizarre and weird to me. So I thought, well, surely they have hamburgers. I mean, in America, like any restaurant has a hamburger, like, if you don't like anything else, you can always just get a burger. So I was just like, yeah, I'll just have a burger, And my mom's like, they don't have burgers. The initial stage was the most where you're just totally naive. You're just like, oh my, what? Like, what do you mean they don't have burgers? But
so in the missiological community, they have a term for what you're describing. And it's way bigger even than just stuff like food, although it certainly includes the food. It's called culture shock. And so, you were going through culture shock. By the way, for any of you who may be listening to this podcast and who may be thinking about, going somewhere to be a missionary, if you're going to bring anyone along with you, it could be your spouse, it could be your children. You probably want to, shall we say, socialize that a bit. Don't simply, grab them and drop them into a situation where they have very little context, and help them understand, as John was just indicating, the duration of the commitment. Because, they may be thinking one thing and you're thinking another. And while it's all well and good to serve the Lord, we also have an obligation to our families to communicate with them and to help them in those transitional times. So anyway, John, you made it. Before we switch to Tanya, I do want to ask, though, what was it like dropping into school and trying to learn and just stay up to speed, not get beat up as the new kid in town? I mean, what was that all like?
Well, we had already transitioned to homeschooling the year before. I think it was a year or two before we went on the mission field. So that helped, So we were just homeschooling. So I didn't really have the school experience. So it was mostly just, meeting kids in the neighborhood and that kind of thing, and trying to learn the language and that kind of thing. So I didn't really have like a school experience, which just mostly hanging out with people at the church, and then kids in the neighborhood, trying to learn the language. I mean, when we first went, I mean, I was, as far as my faith, I mean, I think it all became more real for me when actually while we're in Russia. That was like, there's kind of like different stages, I think, when you grow up as a believer, it was actually at one of the services at the church we were kind of helping out with there. I mean, I was just a kid. I'd often not even be in on the service. I'd be out running around with some missionary friends or something. But I remember I always like noticed that it was impressive how many people would come up at these altar calls, because they do an altar call every single Sunday. And I noticed that there would be like at least 15 people. It could be up to 30 people like every single Sunday that would come up and respond to these altar calls. And I remember hearing the same old altar call, like just that I've heard probably, dozens of times. But for whatever reason, I happened to walk back into the service with my friend, and we were just kind of sitting up in the back, just not engaged, but I was just kind of listening. And I think that was the first time where just hearing the gospel spoken over again, I think it was the first time where I felt like it hit me, like it went from my head to my heart, sort of, and I kind of realized like, wow, like this isn't just for like the people, Russia and all these nations. This is like for me. This is for me personally. Jesus actually died for me. So I think that was probably one of the first sort of, I don't know, kind of like an encounter where it became more real to me. I kind of really like to compare it to Samuel's experience as a kid, when he finally heard, like he was already serving serving the Lord basically under Eli, but he didn't really know the Lord, until God spoke to him, and then everything kind of changed, kind of like that, kind of experience.
Yep. All right. And Tanya, how did you, you weren't an MK, you were living in Ukraine. How did you come to faith?
Oh, I grew up in a family, non-Christian family. My great grandmother and they were Christians, but I did not know a lot about God. I remember growing as a child, I always wanted to have a Bible, because it was Soviet Union. We could not find Bibles. There was no such a thing. You just, wow, like I heard there is a book, Bible, it's about God, but where to get it? So when I was around 11 or 12 years old, around 9, when the Iron Curtain was down, we started having those movies, cartoons, Superbook cartoons about Jesus.
So and TV?
They started showing them on TV, and they said, if you want to know about Jesus, write us a letter, we'll send you books. So they would send us little books, and in the end, there was a prayer of repentance in the end of those books. And I remember we get together, all the kids in the neighborhood. We went on the roof to get closer to God, and holding hands and just praying the prayer of repentance by ourselves, calling on God, not knowing what we've been doing. And we were like 11, really, 11 something, or 10 even. And just like, okay, we did it, but we did not feel anything, but really felt like something God was calling us, and me personally, but we did not understood. We didn't have enough knowledge. So to make the long story short, I found the church. My sister and we found the church. And at one of the evening, they were showing preaching of Billy Graham. And I came there, and he was preaching like about hell and heaven, and how in hell there are more people, not prostitutes, not drug addicted people, not magicians, but he saw in the hell religious people. And back then I thought, I feel I'm very religious, and I just was convicted by the Holy Spirit that even being just 12 years old, that I'm a sinner and I'm going to hell. I'm a good girl, but I felt very religious. So, and after that, all our lives, my lives personally, got changed immediately. And my dad was actually, he used to drink alcohol very heavy. And my mom was on the edge of divorce, but my sister and I, we've been praying for my parents. I thought it would be a miracle my dad would be saved. Seriously, it was bad. But through the crisis in our lives, my sister, she lost her mind and she got in the hospital. Anyway, my dad actually got saved. And how he got saved was I just have to tell the story. He wanted to go to church, to his father's church, to my, to beat up a pastor, Bill Lynch. Because my dad, he did not have any knowledge of God, and he thought because the reason why my sister lost her mind is because of the church. It was totally not true, but when he came to church, there was such a presence of God, and he felt conviction too, and he came home, he fell on his knees, and he gave life to Jesus.
The lady gave him instructions how to pray.
Yeah, and the lady gave him instruction how to pray for my sister, which was a prayer of deliverance. And from the first day of his repentance, he prayed for my sister of a prayer of deliverance, and seeing demons speaking to her and flying, set her free immediately. And he's like, wow, God is real. So then he started practicing that in the neighborhood, all our apartment building. It was people would come to our a little apartment to get healed, to know about God, get delivered. So, yeah.
Wow.
So that's
okay. We had somebody on the show a while back that was my translator when I was in Armenia last year. And she had a similar story of growing up in the Soviet Union, and Bibles were not available. God was mocked in the schools. Of course, God is mocked in the U.S. schools now. But anyway, and she said it was a very difficult thing. But then when she found the Lord, it was very similar to what you're describing. I don't think most of our listeners really appreciate what it's like to live in a society like the one we have here in the West. They may mock the Lord, but at least it's not forbidden. And if you want to find a Bible, if you want to learn about Jesus, there are ways to do that. There are people to tell you about it. But in your childhood, you might talk about God at the risk of your life, or a long visit to the Gulag Archipelago. So it's a very different world, and I don't think we're always as thankful for what we have here in America as we might be.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so let's see, John, why don't you tell us maybe one or two stories? We have a fixed interval here today. We could probably go on for hours, but tell us one or two short stories about what it was like in Ukraine when you got there. What was it like to be a kid there? What was it like to grow up there? How long did it take you to learn the language?
Yeah. Well, we were in Russia for just a little less than a year before we actually moved to Ukraine, which was that was kind of a whole adventure. I remember one of the trips we went back to the States before we moved to Ukraine. There was we were already talking with another pastor that was going to move to Kharkov, the city we ended up planting the church in. And then we actually ended up going with them to help them start their church before we actually moved and started a church. And I just remember one of the confirmations that we got was, what my parents got at the time was, we were in a prayer meeting in America, and someone actually got the word Kharkov, not even knowing, like having no clue what it even was. Like for all they knew, it could have been like the name of a person, and apparently they'd already been praying about going to Kharkov. And here this prayer meeting in America says, I have this word for you, it's Kharkov, and I don't know what it is, so that was like a real clear confirmation. The first time I went to Kharkov, it was kind of crazy. We actually ended up getting thrown off the train. We had to take a train from Kostroma, Russia, to Moscow, then from Moscow to Kharkov. But the train we were supposed to get on to Kharkov from Moscow, we didn't know it at the time, but it turned out the mafia, the Russian mafia, if they ever wanted to, get a ticket, they would basically just tell the train conductor that they need a ticket, and they basically just like cancel someone else's tickets and give them to them. And so we came to the train and they wouldn't let us on. and then my dad was talking to him, and they were getting all upset, and like there was this big argument. And then it turned out it was the mafia. We didn't know it at the time, I guess, but it would turn into this wild adventure. We ended up jumping on the train because we were like, we have tickets and we're allowed. And then these mafia guys jumped on us and started trying to shove us off the train after it started moving. And so it turned into this wild experience. And thankfully, nobody got hurt. We ended up just getting off and not trying to fight him or anything. But God kind of spared us. I mean, there was a Russian policeman that came over when it was all happening, and he did nothing. And we were like, apparently they were asking him, like, why aren't you doing anything? And he was like, no, this is the mafia. I can't do anything. But that was the first time we went to Kharkov. I mean, once we moved there, it was just, it all went so fast. Like we did some concerts with a group that came from Russia with us to do like some outreaches, like a crusade kind of thing in different parts of the city. And then it just kind of all took off from just starting to have meetings in our house and in the apartment we had. I remember the very first meeting we had, a Satanist came to our first meeting and ended up getting deliverance, and it turned into this pretty dramatic deliverance like prayer that happened. And it was just all kind of bizarre, like he actually,
He came through the window, right?
No, he came through. It was this unusual apartment building. Usually they only have like one entrance, but this one actually had like a back sort of entrance from the back side of the apartment building, and that like wasn't commonly used. So it's kind of like people would store stuff back there in that stairwell, and like you kind of didn't even know it was there. So this Satanist kind of like came to our apartment through the back door, which was kind of creepy and weird. But it was like, all right. That he ended up getting deliverance though. So that was like the very first, gathering we had. And then it just kind of grew really rapidly, and we eventually moved into a different building. And at the time I was just a kid, so I was just kind of, watching all this happen, kind of. And then I only started getting more into ministry when I was 13 years old. I started playing in the worship band and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, but it was fast. The church grew up super fast. Like, I think, I don't know the numbers, but it was fast.
John, your mother has told some stories on this podcast, and I remember talking to your dad about it when he was alive, about just how bitterly cold it was and how your apartment, you didn't really control the heat. It was all governed by some central office, and they would give you steam when they thought it was appropriate, and often then only maybe for a couple of hours a day. And in the middle of the winter, you kind of had to dress in those big giant Russian furry hats and the heavy coats and everything in your own apartment. What did you think of that kind of situation? I mean, most Americans would consider that pretty extreme hardship. And just a simple question. I don't know if you even remember anything like this, but in the US, when we get a cold snap, say in the Eastern US, not so much in Southern California or even in Washington or Oregon, they'll report the numbers of people who have died due to the cold. Did they ever report numbers like that in Ukraine? Or was it just sort of, whatever, people die and that's the way it goes?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I ever heard those numbers. Tanya might have heard them growing up. But...
No, there were a lot of, there was no food in the stores.
Yeah,
people were eating pigeons, catching rats, mice. That was like right after the Iron Curtain fell. And it was cold, and we were sleeping in the hats. And sometimes you have to walk to your work for an hour in the freezing cold, or to go to church, which was also very cold. You'd like shiver and really just, and the services was not like 1 or 2 hours. They were like 3, 4, 5 hours, because there was so much Holy Spirit there. People did not want to leave at all. Even it was very, that was for me right now growing up. I realized what a hunger.
Yeah,
there was a huge hunger. Like this, Kharkov is like almost 2 million people. To get to church, it will take you, sometimes it will take you 1 hour and a half, changing 2 or 3 public transportations. Most people did not have cars back then. So you are standing on the streets, you drive in the bus, trolley bus, metro, whatever it takes, go to church, and then it's freezing cold. And then you stay up late till 9 or 11 trying to figure out how to get back home.
And I think that was the worst. Like when you come in from the cold and you still can't really get warm, because especially playing. I remember you're playing like instruments and your fingers are freezing. And I was always impressed by that. I was like, man, I can't believe these people are coming to church. Like, it's so cold. Like, that was very impressive just to see the hunger.
Yeah, the hunger was huge.
Yeah. Well, we're starting to see some of that hunger in the U.S. Like the last couple of weeks, the meetings I've led, the places I've gone, it's been pretty off the chain, and it's getting more off the chain as I'm going along. So I'm looking forward to seeing that kind of hunger in the United States.
Amen. Yes.
Amen.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So let's keep going with this conversation. John, at one point you felt called to the ministry, and specifically you married a Ukrainian. You remained in Ukraine to carry on the work that your parents began. How did that calling come to you? And Tanya, the reciprocal question, when did you feel called to the ministry?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I kind of grew up with a sort of core value that you just serve the Lord, and I actually had this sort of like belief that like, especially when I was a teenager, that it was, and I was pretty blunt about it, like that basically, like what else can you do in life? If you're not a missionary, then you're pretty much just not doing anything for the Lord. So it's like almost like there's no other option. Like if you really want to serve the Lord, And
well, you are Bill Lynch's son, after all.
I know. Looking back, I'm like, man, I can't. That was kind of dramatic. Like, I was talking to a guy when we were visiting the States one time. We were visiting someone's house and they had a keyboard and I was playing guitar with him and we were just kind of jamming. And then we started talking. He's like, what do you want to do in life? Or what do you plan? What do you want to do? And I was pretty young then, I was like, well, I'm going to be a missionary, like what else is there to do in life? But I mean, later I got more into like youth ministry. We did a lot of outreach ministry. And then, fast forward, I was a youth pastor for like 7 years. I don't know. I did at one point feel like I wanted to start a business, but that really didn't ever happen. I did like dabble in different business like ventures in our beginning stages when we first got married and stuff. But mostly it was just, I felt a real passion for the lost and just for evangelism. And then fast forward 2011, we went to BSSM to Bethel to go to the school. At that time, I had been our youth pastor for about 7 years, and we were kind of burnt out. Like I would say, like just sort of tired, and like everything felt kind of dry. Like it just seemed like we were kind of going through the motions, but not really experiencing a lot of God. And even though, I mean, we believed all the stuff. We'd seen some of it. But in reality, if I was honest, it was like nothing was really happening. Like we weren't seeing people getting healed. It was just kind of, trying to disciple people and just doing what we needed to do. And then, that was a real big turning point for us. When we got to go to Bethel and be there for 3 years, it was just a really powerful time. And actually when we went, we weren't even sure at that point. We were kind of like, yeah, we want to just be open. Who knows, maybe God wants us somewhere else. Maybe we're not called to actually be in Ukraine forever, like maybe God wants us to redirect us somewhere else. So we were kind of open to letting that be a season where he might redirect us. But more and more, we kept getting words and confirmations about how God wanted us to bring back to Ukraine what we had received at Bethel. And I kept getting prophecies about getting new tools, new weapons, and never going back to the old ones. And then, and it was funny because when we left, and well, just my personal experience when God was doing these amazing things in my life personally, and just seeing more breakthrough gifts. I had this sort of feeling like, oh man, I hope this is actually transferable. Like I felt it was almost like this, like fear, like, I mean, we can't bring all our people to Bethel. It's not like they can all go to BSSM. And it was really kind of like gnawing at me and plus this sort of feeling like, oh, our guys are over there in the field, kind of like soldiers feel like when they get pulled out of the battle, and they feel like I'd rather be back there with my guys, and instead of just being here enjoying this amazing time. And then one guy was praying for me, and he got a word in tongues, and he was like, John, I got a word in tongues. I feel like you'll have an interpretation for it. And I was just like, well, I've actually never gotten interpretation of tongues before, but go for it. Maybe God will, reveal what it is. And so he just said this word. He was a guy from Alaska that, just an American guy from our group, from our class. So he said this word, he said, Piritadash. That's what it sounded like. And at first I didn't realize, I asked him to repeat it. I was like, wait, what was it? And so he repeated it. And then I realized it was Russian. And he didn't know a word in Russian from in his life. Like he'd never learned any Russian. And I was like, do you know Russian? And he was like, no, I don't know any Russian. And I was like, the word you just said means you'll transfer something.
Wow.
Almost and it was really bizarre because and it's not just you'll transfer something. It's almost like you'll transfer something that's already been transferred, almost like double kind of like you'll over transfer something. It was really bizarre. And so that was a huge confirmation for us that, yeah, we got to go back. Cause
there was a word
to equip people. And so that was kind of a new era just of really when things started blowing up, we started really equipping people in the prophetic and seeing more healing happen on the streets and just overall, in the church, more of that happening. So that was
the war too.
Yeah. And that was right. And that was right after the war started in 2014 in the eastern part of Ukraine. Well, that was when we came back. So there was a lot of fear and concern that it might, its way to our city because we were, real far east. But we felt like we
So
needed.
this was when the war over that border area began. This is not the main war that we're hearing about right now. Just for the clarity of our listeners, they may not be aware that there's been some activity going on for about 4 or 5 years now with the Russians trying to take back the eastern part of Ukraine and also Crimea.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, they took Crimea without one shot, even fired. And then when they started taking the other two eastern regions of Ukraine, the farthest eastern ones, then it turned into this war, and they started fighting, and there was a lot of concern. A lot of people were leaving our city because there was a real threat that it might make its way to our city because we're real close to those areas. And so when we came back, we found ourselves in a place where there was just this sudden massive need of like refugees. And in fact, there was one, we just kind of were like, wow. Like, so we started helping refugees. There was just a huge wave of people fleeing the east, where the fighting started. And our city was the biggest city closest to the eastern regions where the fighting started. So we just had these like thousands of people every day coming to our city. But it was amazing. We started seeing God started moving, and just, I think one of the most phenomenal things, like testimonies, is, why don't you share the one about the lady? Well, we started going to one of the cities real close to ours that's like even further east. And we were able to obtain a list of refugees that were kind of trying to settle there. And so we started bringing them food, trying to contact them. And, they didn't know us, so they were afraid to let us into their homes. But so we were just meeting them like in the middle of the town, like by a supermarket, and just to bring them bags of food and stuff. And this one lady we met to give her some food, Tanya was just chatting with her, and she found out that she had a problem with her knee. And it turned out her knee joint had a birth defect. In her whole life, she was never able to bend the knee at all. Like, it wouldn't bend like at all. It was just totally straight. Her leg was straight. So she would kind of hobble, trying to walk because she couldn't bend one of her legs. And Tanya was like, well, we can pray for you. We pray for healing. And so she agreed. And it was funny. I wasn't with her because we had a lot of people, and I didn't want to spook her because with too many people. So it was just her and one of the other girls, right? But I could watch everything that was happening just kind of from far off. And so she started praying for her. She put her hand on the lady's knee. And right in the middle of just praying for her knee jerked, like really like noticeably, like it just jerked suddenly. And the lady was like, whoa, what was that? and Tanya was like, I don't know, like maybe God's healing you. Like, and then you had her test it out. Is that?
Yeah, I asked her to test it out, and she could bend her knee for the first time in her life. And it was amazing. And she gave her life to Jesus, and she called her son, oh, please pray for my son. And right in the middle of the marketplace.
I know, it was amazing. She started bending it, walking around. She was like, wow, now I can work in my garden. But she was so excited. It was like just amazing, So there's a lot of people got saved, I mean, the same thing's kind of happening now too, but it's just like another wave, another stage.
But bigger, I would say bigger stage.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
A whole other scale now with the war happening, But a lot of people did.
I don't mean to interrupt you. Just
go ahead.
Made the comment about the war, and I was going to say, and what is happening with the war? We hear all kinds of things over here, including that there's a big Russian offensive going to start in the spring. How is everybody preparing for that? What's the mentality there with regard to the war, et cetera?
It's kind of hard to pin down one view because it's always changing. And I think to some degree that's happened so many times. Like sometimes they expect like, oh, it could get bad again. The Russians might, but it just varies. Like the last period we're expecting could be bad was the anniversary, the 24th. And so we're actually over in Kharkov around that time. So we were kind of concerned, that might get bad because it's real close to the border. But I mean, thankfully they did send a lot of rockets, but as far as we know, they have, depleted so much of their resources.
Oh, that day when 7 rockets were flying to Kharkov, they wanted to have a massive attack, but they all of them. What happened to them? Remember,
none of them reached their targets. None of
them reached the target.
They either got shot down or they just didn't even make it or something. So, but I mean, I don't know. It has intensified in a lot of ways where they're a little bit more desperate in mobilizing people in Ukraine. So a lot of the the men are more concerned about being drafted, and we've had more people killed. We have 2 men from our church that got killed in combat. So we were just at a funeral just like a couple of weeks ago, and this guy was a father from our church. He was actually fighting with his son together. They just volunteered when the war started, and they've been fighting this whole time, like for pretty much almost a whole year since the war started. And he got promoted really a ton because they were really like one of the top, like without any experience, he became some of the best, and they ended up like liberating a lot of the towns and villages around our region in Kharkov, like when there was the big sort of counteroffensive that happened. But yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's always like nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. They always try to, predict what might happen. And
like, I know for sure that people praying a lot. Like there are prayer meeting every day, is like day and night. Churches getting together at Zoom if they're all over Ukraine, because a lot of people just displaced. They're not in one town or village or area, so they pray 2 times a day, 6 a.m, 8 p.m, at night, fasting. Like, all the churches we're talking, they fasting and praying. And if you talk to unbelievers, people are tired of war, but they still have strength, and that we're getting there. We're getting to the victory. Like, we're not gonna give up. The spirit of people, I would say, more on the side of, not on the side of, what's gonna happen, everything's gonna be bad, but on the side, no, there's no way we're gonna win this battle. I would say this way.
Wow. We just have no idea of what that's like to live in a state of war. The damage to the infrastructure, the disruption to life. We've just never had that in the U.S., not since going back to the Civil War. So it's been, more than 150 years, well over 150 years. And so people just have no memory of anything like that.
Yeah, it's true. It is kind of surreal, just to imagine that it is. As far as I know, it's the largest scale war we've had since World War II. I mean, with just the scale of it and everything, and it's just so. It's just it has it takes a toll. There's a real emotional toll. Like it's just like you're okay, and then every once in a while it just really kind of like weighs down on you. Just the overall kind of state of things, and people being displaced, and like especially I mean the toughest part was obviously the beginning, like because we were in Kharkov when it started, so we were able to get out and we were fine. We weren't in any like immediate danger, but we were starting to hear explosions from the northern side of the city, and like but it was just nobody knew what was going to happen. There was a lot of fear. We weren't perfectly prepared, so we just tried to get out of there as soon as we could. We drove out, and we're afraid to go too far south because they were invading from the south. But then we're afraid to, like the typical way would be the highway to Kiev to go west. But that was dangerous because, for all we know, they could have taken that highway, and so we were going these weird routes, trying to stay as close as we could to the center of Ukraine, because nobody knew. We didn't know if it was like, they're going to be bombing the whole country, or if it was just certain areas, and nobody knew it was going to happen. So and then the first probably week or so, like at first we felt like we're just going to get out and then see what happens, and we were kind of expecting we'll probably fly back to the States, and we wanted to go to the States anyways and kind of see what happens, and maybe wait till it blows over. But then when we got to Romania, we found ourselves just on the phone, like it was just like nonstop, like pretty much it would start about 6 a.m. and you would go till like midnight, just pretty much nonstop on the phone, talking to people like that are desperate and panicking, like trying to figure out, just trying to help people get out and all this crazy stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And we were able to evacuate all people who wanted to be evacuated.
Yeah.
Which is very big relief for us because it was heavy. So most of our people left the city. So I think just maybe 20, 30 people left from our church who decided to stay.
Yeah.
And have they fared well? How's it going?
Yeah, the people who stayed are okay. I mean, it's been dangerous, like the first week or so, there were a number of people that stayed and actually were very active, like literally driving around the city, risking their lives to help evacuate people and that didn't have cars or just bringing supplies to people and different things. And then, and God protected them. And eventually more people, left. There was just a lot of different waves of there was the first wave of people that left, got out the first day the war started. And then some people are just more reluctant to leave. So they waited and then they eventually left. And then there was a stage when they finally started evacuating people on trains. And that was just it was just horrendous. There were people almost getting trampled because people were getting so desperate and panicking to try to get out. And it was just crazy, And
Wow. Well, so you're there now, you're serving there. And, you mentioned earlier in this podcast that the hunger that you saw in the services of the churches might go 3, 4, 5 hours. Are you seeing comparable hunger in the midst of the war, or has that been has the war distracted people and drawn them away from that pursuit of God?
I think we definitely see more hunger. I mean, I don't know if it's the same as it was then, in the 90s when that whole kind of revival was happening, but it's still definitely a noticeable difference in hunger. I mean, more people are just generally way more open, especially if we visit some of the cities, they're real close to the fighting, and, people they're just open, they're willing to, a lot of them just easily get saved, if you offer them to pray, and they're definitely more open. I guess it's just the reality of when you get into a crisis like this, it's hard to not just be kind of crushed under the circumstances and kind of realize your brokenness and realize how needy you really are, for something more than anything humanity can provide,
Yeah, if you ask anyone, if you do you believe in God, everybody say, yes, I pray every day. And they eager to have Bibles and to read their Bibles. Churches are full with new believers, just are full of new believers. And we actually have a big trouble of finding leaders, because what happened, unfortunately, most Christians, they left the country for the sake of their families, most leaders. So, and then just you stayed. And then, so we have this story that we hear almost every day if you talk to any pastor. My church was 300 people, more than half of them, right? Or
well, in many cases, 90% of the people left.
Yeah, left.
That's pretty typical.
And right now they're full with new believers. So it depends on the size of your church, how much capacity you can have. And that's, we are here in Ukraine and we joined the church, and that's what happened. No kids, no women, just men in church.
When older people.
Yeah, and just
older generation.
refugees, new believers, just who stayed, they just come to church, it's just full.
Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. That's incredible. Especially because in the West, most churches are approximately 2/3 women and 1/3 men. The percentage can vary a little bit, but it's unusual to see a church that's even, 50-50. And you're talking about churches that are full of men, but the women and the children aren't there.
Yeah, it's really different now. There's a lot of older people.
Older people, yeah.
Because they're the ones that typically stay. They just don't want to leave, for various reasons. But so there's a lot of them, and then there's. And then in some cases, the men send off their wives and children to Europe or just to get out, to get them out of the country, but they're not allowed to leave, and because they're fighting age, and so there's a lot of that, too.
Wow. Well, okay, we're about out of time. Let's conclude this by why don't you give us your thoughts on where you think the move of God in Ukraine is headed, and maybe beyond Ukraine too. I don't know. It kind of depends on, what you want to speak to, but we've got, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, and then we probably need to be done.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when this all happened, our church, just as an example, which is kind of like a real pretty accurate reflection of what happened with most of the believers in churches in Ukraine. We pretty much, most of the church got scattered, like literally, like we have people in England, France, Netherlands, America, Canada, just all over the place, Poland, Romania. They're just like all over Europe, all over other parts of Ukraine where they never lived before. And it just so much reminds me of the situation in Acts, with the early church, where some would say that arguably, there may have never been the missions movement that we had seen in Acts if it wasn't for the persecution that scattered them, but then it says, but as they were scattered, they preached the gospel. So it turned into this massive like missions movement. So I feel like we've been talking about that in our church. It's just like, we've been feeling like as soon as it all happened, I just had that in my heart, and we just kept kind of sort of exhorting people on that, like you're not a refugee, like you're a missionary, like you just change your identity, because God wants to use this. The circumstances are horrible, and persecution was probably not any fun, but it did cause the people to be scattered, and it did cause everything to spread. And it's like, that's what's really happening. Like there's all these there's this amazing apostolic thing like being born that probably would have never happened, and not that, obviously we believe God used everything for the good. Like I'm stepping into more of an apostolic role now, which is kind of like a thing, which is not very natural for me, but it's like, it's happening. Like we have people that are starting churches. We have people that are taking over churches that like kind of fell apart because everyone's scattered. And so like we're finding ourselves more in a role of pastoring other pastors and kind of like
new pastors,
helping leaders all around Ukraine. And I think that's a real clear, I think that's happening with a lot of churches. So I think, as far as what God's doing, there's definitely a new level of hunger and, people just being really broken, by these circumstances, and really, realizing they need God, and I don't know, I'm wanting to believe that it's like that dream that one of my dad's disciples had a long, long time ago, where people were just waking up in our city and being like, I need to go to church, like just total unbelievers, like just from out of nowhere, just having this urge, like, I need to find a church. I need to go to church, But you want to go ahead and add something?
Yeah, I just love what God doing it. Like businessmen became pastors, missionaries, just something you would never guess. It's very interesting who decided to take that call.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Well, sometimes when your circumstances change, you rethink the assumptions you've had. Mm-hmm. And so that would undoubtedly have something to do with it. But, back on the thing your dad used to talk about, nobody ever really comes to the Lord for all the quote unquote right reasons. They come to the Lord because their life is in pain, their marriage is falling apart, their children are straying or worse. And there we go. Their children are straying or worse. They've got problems and they want God to fix their problems, and they're out of other options often. And so they're coming in a position of humility that maybe they didn't previously have. Mm-hmm. And but I don't think I've ever heard of anybody come to the Lord because they were concerned with the glory of God, and they wanted to know that from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, the name of the Lord would be praised. And they just wanted to be part of that great multitude that will be on Mount Zion one day, worshiping the Lamb. I mean, nobody comes to faith that way. Mm-hmm. So when you tell me about all of this, I think, this might well be the seeds of an amazing spread of the gospel, of a revival not just in Ukraine, but well beyond and throughout Eastern Europe and perhaps even to all of Europe. But boy, it's a hard birth, isn't it?
Mhm.
That's true.
It is.
Yeah.
That's true. I was talking to what pastor in Hungary that we know that they've been there for like more than 20 years or 30 years. And they have their hopes up too. They're like, we've seen so many waves of refugees, and mostly like Muslim refugees. And that was like a whole different, thing. But they're like, with this thing happening, there are a lot of believers that are being scattered. So they have this like hope that this could actually bring, a revival fire to Europe that they desperately need too, just because of all these Ukrainians being scattered all over Europe, so.
Yeah.
It's really that.
And Ukrainians are very natural evangelists. They just, if they like something, they just like want to sell it, not to sell it to tell everyone, like, come on, like, that's cool there. So I'm not going to go without you. I'm just going there just to be together with you and go there. So it's just very natural for Ukrainians to be that way. So they pull in on each other.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you guys when we come to Ukraine later this year and participating in all that the Lord is doing through your ministry there. It's an amazing thing that you are back there. And I don't know, you guys are clearly showing your commitment to what you're called to, and you're not going to lose your reward in heaven. And may the Lord bless the work you're doing now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
All right, guys. Well, we will wrap it up here because unfortunately we've run out of time. I could talk with you for hours, but Grant, do you have anything you want to add?
No, just thank you so much for your commitment and for your stories. And I'm looking forward to having you guys back on for sure. I think there's so much more we can talk about. So hopefully you'll be able to come on for part 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would be honored. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Ken. And thank you all for listening and for joining us. And we look forward to being right back here this time next week with another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.